and welcome to another episode of Save Corrupted. I'm your host, Liam, and this is just a brief introductory segment to kind of set up our guest today and introduce the podcast. I won't take too much of your time. This episode in general is a short and sweet one. The actual body comes in at just over an hour, which is a little shorter than our normal episodes, but I felt it was appropriate for the topic. I debated whether or not to throw in a few more questions to bring it up to the kind of standard 90 minutes that we've done so far on the show, but then I figured why bloat an episode unnecessarily just to preserve it with an arbitrary kind of length format. I think it's best perhaps that each episode just sits at the appropriate length. And so I think that we got out of the episode what I intended. The guest for today's episode is Dr. Patrick Stokes. He teaches philosophy at Deakin University, and one of the great things about having him on as our first guest to represent the discipline that I love, philosophy, so much on the show, is that Patrick is committed to a manner of doing philosophy that makes philosophy accessible. And I think that comes across in the very kind of natural and matter-of-fact way that he speaks, drawing a lot of points from real life to emphasize or to underline the arguments that he's making. Patrick is also a scholar of the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, and one of the questions in the episode, I had to put it in simply because I know how much he cares about Kierkegaard, so I figured it'd be interesting to hear him talk about him. So one of the questions in the episode does touch on Kierkegaard. It's not necessarily forced, because I do think that Kierkegaard's philosophy is represented in the game that we talk about in this episode, that Dragon Cancer. But I make reference to another thing alongside Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, one of his books. I make reference to the book A Very Easy Death by the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. One of these references I make because it's directly implicated by the text, the other because I think it works well by analogy. I mean, it's the same sort of thing that Dragon Cancer is attempting to do, but in another medium. So, despite that, we don't go into a lot of detail regarding the actual content of both of the books. So, in case anyone is curious about that, or they just want some textual reference, or to engage in a deeper understanding of the issues that we use them to illuminate, I'm going to include some footnotes to this episode, which will involve me reading some passages from both of those books. So hopefully some of you will find that interesting. For those who are interested in how Patrick speaks and want to hear more of him, he's recently started a podcast with a kind of format similar to this show about philosophy, representing Deakin University, in which he sits down with philosophers and other peers and talks to them for about half an hour on an issue of concern. That podcast is called Deconstruction, and if anyone's curious, I'll post a link to it in the episode description, so you can check that out if you wish. So without further ado, let's get to the episode. I hope you enjoy, and if you like the show, feel free to follow the show on Facebook, the Facebook page. The show also has an Instagram, so if you search Save Corrupted on both of those platforms, you should find it pretty handily. Thank you very much again for listening. Hello and welcome to another episode of Save Corrupted, a podcast about video game history, archival, and why video games should be preserved in the first place. My name is Liam, and today we have a very special guest for a very unique and special topic on this show. Would you care to introduce yourself, sir?
Hello, I'm Patrick Stokes. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy for my sins at Deakin University of Melbourne, which is where we are right now.
Yes, indeed, in a very nice office with a very impressive bookshelf.
Thank you.
Now, I know that you've just come off a cold, given the winter season, but you and I are pretty healthy in general and vital chaps,
Yeah, okay.
Within reason. So let's talk about death for a bit.
This is an audio medium, so I'm happy to go with that.
Yeah, exactly. We might as well. So death is a classic philosophical topic.
Mm-hmm.
It's been discussed by philosophers for thousands of years. It's probably one of the topics in ordinary experience which would most likely compel a layperson, to pick up an introduction to philosophy book.
Sure.
Yeah. But today I'd like to focus on the particular issue of how the living relate to the dead.
Mm-hmm.
It's often said that we have duties to the dead. Do you think there's a philosophical basis for these duties, and what might those duties be?
Yeah. So I think that there are a few different philosophical bases available for that.
Yeah.
And that tells you something.
Right.
It tells you that we have a kind of intuitive sense that we have some sort of moral duty to the dead, right? We take it that... I'll give you the classic example I use every time I discuss this. This is from Raymond Gator from The Philosopher's Dog. He talks about what happened to Charlie Chaplin, which a lot of people don't know this, but when Charlie Chaplin died, he was living in Switzerland, he was buried. About a month after he died, a gang of criminals dug up his coffin.
Really?
And basically stole away with it and then issued basically a ransom demand. They said to the family, we'll give us X amount of money and you can have Charlie Chaplin's body back.
Wow.
They ended up catching them. The body was returned to the grave.
Oh, good.
All good. And Gator talks about that and he says, now, it's natural when we look at that to say that was a really horrible thing to do to Charlie Chaplin. Poor Charlie Chaplin that this has been done to him, that he's been dug up. What an indignity. Don't treat Charlie Chaplin like that, right? Yeah. Now, we think that, and yet at the same time, we are also completely aware that Charlie Chaplin no longer exists, right? So we have these dueling intuitions, right? That on the one hand, the dead don't exist. On the other hand, there is somehow wrong things that we can do to the dead, and also right things, right? So, I mean, the example I've used in teaching quite often is a few years ago, the guy who was convicted and executed in the 1920s of the Gun Alley murder,
right?
Colin Campbell Ross. He was exonerated by the Victorian government. The conviction was quashed. Even that, and that was in a way the right thing to do for Colin Campbell Ross, not just for his descendants, but also for him,
right?
Even though he didn't exist. In the same way, stealing Charlie Chaplin's corpse is a terrible thing to do to Charlie Chaplin, not just to the Chaplin family.
Right.
So we have this sense, and it goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle actually said that it would be heartless to deny that the dead are affected by the fortunes or misfortunes of their descendants, which is an uncharacteristically sentimental thing for Aristotle to say. So there is this kind of... this strong sense that people have that the dead can be harmed and benefited that runs smack back up against the metaphysical assumption that the dead don't exist anymore.
Right. The
sort of Epicurean assumption, right? Where we are, death is not, and where death is, we are no more.
Yeah, I was going to reference that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
Well, you remembered that, though. That's good. The interesting thing about that is that we then have to then come up with these kind of after-the-fact metaphysical answers to explain why we have this concern for the dead, how the dead can be harmed or benefited. F.H. Bradley once said that metaphysics is the art of coming up with bad reasons for things that we know on instinct anyway. And that's, to a certain extent, what's happened. And they're not bad reasons necessarily. They're brilliant arguments. They're incredibly clever arguments that have been put forward. But they all have this feeling of being almost post hoc rationalizations of intuitions that we're already kind of committed to anyway.
Right.
So, in some ways, I think the real answers are to be found on the level of phenomenology rather than on the level of metaphysics.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is, in a way, the way we encounter the dead, our actual kind of phenomenal encounter with the dead, that's where all the action's happening. That's where the real kind of questions are arising. Mm-hmm. Now, metaphysics can be part of how we do phenomenology, right? Metaphysics can inform the way we see the world.
Yep.
But in a way, I think trying to find what's the real answer here. Well, the real answer here is that the dead continue in our life world as objects of loving regard. They just do. They're just there in that way. But they're there in this incredibly ambiguous way where they're both there and not there. I'm drawing heavily on Kierkegaard here, who talks about some of this stuff. But and to me, that ambiguity of the dead is where a lot of these problems start off from. They actually start off from this deeply ambiguous way we have of relating to the dead, where they're not there, but they are. We have duties to them, and yet we can't help or harm them, and yet we can help and harm them. So they're just fundamentally ambiguous, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of seems like, in a certain sense, the dead, like the figure of the ghost, is the best way to think about it. It's something which is simultaneously there in a location, but not corporeal.
Exactly. I mean, ghosts are traditionally depicted as transparent.
Yeah.
Now, there's an argument that's actually a hangover from 18th century stage technology, that it was when the things like the Pepper's Ghost illusion or the magic lanterns and stuff depicted these images as translucent. That's where the idea of translucency came from. I'm not sure how true that is.
Right.
But the translucent appearance of ghosts reflects the ontological ambiguity. They're both there and not there.
Yeah.
Haunting is this weird kind of ontological sort of half and half thing when somebody's both there and not there, and literally interstitial in a way, like literally interstitial between being and not being.
Exactly.
there's a reason why where ghosts appear is referred to as liminal space. It's meant to be this sort of, space in between two different kinds of being, or
Sure.
being and not being.
Could you just define ontology quickly for the listeners?
Ontology meaning just the study of being, the study of what is.
What is.
Effectively.
Cool. Brilliant. All right, well, let's talk about a particular duty to the dead,
Mm-hmm.
namely the duty to commemorate or memorialise the dead.
Sure.
So there's a recent work by a group of scholars that you actually turned me on to at the University of Melbourne. They're focused on how the rituals and institutions dedicated to this duty, they're characterised by tradition, right? They don't change for a long time. They're now in a kind of tension against the increasing pervasiveness of digital technology and the internet in everyday life. This show is particularly interested in video games, but before we get there, could you please talk to the general changes that the internet has brought about to how we relate to the dead?
Sure. So one big change has been just the ease of offloading memory.
Yeah.
We've always used memory prostheses. We've always used, aids memoir. We write things down. We, take pictures of people.
Yeah.
We've always, used, depending how you want to define memory, either we've used things to enhance our memory or we've actually just embedded our memory. I was trying to say embedded and embodied there, and it came out embedded. We embody our memory in physical things in the world,
yeah.
right? So, I mean, if you go in for extended theory of mind, then your notebook or your phone is part of your memory. It's not a thing you use to help with your memory. It's actually just part of the memory system.
Makes sense.
We don't necessarily have to go along with that, but what's interesting about the internet in some ways is that memory now is really cheap. This is a point that Victor Meyer Schoenberger makes in his book, that we've now passed the point, several years ago now in fact, where the cost of digital storage media is less than the average wage it would require to pay someone to sit there deleting things, which means that it's now cheaper to remember by default than to forget by default.
Wow.
You can cut and dice that a couple of ways and talk about other kinds of expense, but it means that we now sort of store everything by default, which in some ways means that it's much, much easier to preserve a whole bunch of things, some of which actually creates problems, right? Because so you may be aware there was a case several years ago in Spain where a Spanish lawyer and entrepreneur Googled his own name, and what came up with a whole bunch of news stories about his bankruptcy from 10 years earlier.
I do remember that. This is the right to be forgotten.
Exactly right. Yeah, and so he was like, well, hang on, that stuff's not relevant. It's damaging my reputation.
Yeah.
So I want it gone. And Google said, well, no, it's not us. It's other people. In the end, this led to a landmark decision by one of the sort of pan-European courts saying that, yes, people have a right to be forgotten, which is intrinsically paradoxical, because how can you have a right to be forgotten given that rights generate duties? That implies that if I have a right to be forgotten, then someone has a duty to forget me. But forgetting is not typically understood to be a deliberate act, right?
Yeah.
You can't really be blamed for having not forgotten something.
Sure.
And so it's already a complicated thing. But part of what's going on there is simply that if all the information's available, we can't use forgetting to make ethical life easier in the way that I think we typically have done.
Right.
We can't simply say, oh yes, he's a member of the moral community in good standing now, because we've just forgotten all the bad stuff he did, because it's all just one click away.
Yeah.
Right. So that means we have to actually somehow get better at forgiving, potentially. Or we just get much, much easier at holding crutches for a long time. So there's an interesting kind of question around that. Changing memory in that way, but also changing our presence in people's lives. Right? So it used to be that unless you were the king, your face wasn't present in many people's lives. If you were the king or the queen, then everyone would see your face every time they went to pay for something.
Right.
Pull out a coin, it's like, oh, that's what Elizabeth looks like, whatever.
Yeah.
Or Augustus or whatever, and your image might not get older as you did, too. But nowadays, your face can be physically present in millions of places at once. Now, for most of us, we're not going to be that present in that many places at once because there aren't millions of people looking at us. But we are able to present a lot more of our phenomenal presence, how we look, how we sound, how we are in the world, to a great many people at a great spatial distance.
Yeah.
Instantaneously. And that's something I work on, is what happens when we die and we leave all that stuff behind, given that we're projecting our face out into the world all the time. What happens when we die but that face persists, right? And that we leave behind what I think we can actually conceive of as digital corpses, right? As digital remains that aren't necessarily... And this is something that's coming up at the moment, actually. The New South Wales Law Reform Commission is currently holding an inquiry into what we do with the digital assets of the dead and incapacitated.
Right.
And one thing I've sort of said to them in my submissions, and I don't think it's going to end up making it into the final cut because it's not a very legal thing to say, but I think that we need to be thinking of a lot of the things that the dead leave behind, not simply as property that you can inherit,
right,
but as more like corpses. You don't inherit a corpse.
No.
Right? You end up with rights of a kind of custodianship and disposal.
Yeah.
Over a corpse. Like, it's up to you to sort of work out how to preserve or dispose of that corpse, but you don't own it as such. You know, you might inherit your grandmother's couch. You don't inherit your grandmother's body.
Right.
So, but you do have a responsibility to dispose of the body. And something like that, I think, is going to be true of a lot of digital remains. They may not be heritable property, but they are part of the person's body, if you like. They're part of the person's presence in the world, and we do have a responsibility to either preserve them or dispose of them. And then the question becomes, well, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah.
With corpses, we dispose of them in the most sort of biologically cleanest way we possibly can, because corpses get very unpleasant very quickly and they become serious disease vectors. That's not true of digital remains, but they're vulnerable in other ways. They're vulnerable to other forms of decay. The platform provider could go broke or could simply decide to delete everything. A server somewhere can fail. A hard disk somewhere can fail. Or formats change. You know, I was chatting about this with someone this morning. There was in the late 80s, there was a big project in the UK where they got all these school kids to record videos and stuff for what was meant to be a thing for the 900th anniversary of the Doomsday Book.
Right.
Which, as you may know, is like basically a huge book of who owned what in all of England. Who owned each bit of land, who owned how many cattle, how many sheep, how many peasants, all that sort of stuff.
Okay.
And so they got all these kids to do all these videos and things talking about life in the UK in the late 1980s and what was going on in their schools and so on.
Right.
Within a few years, nobody had the technology to play the videos anymore. And it took data scientists years working as a special project to actually find a way to go back and replay those videos. Yeah, the format was just lost so quickly.
Wow.
And that's another vulnerability that the digital dead have, is that they are... You can easily get to a point where you can say, oh, I've got a permanent record of this person now, but if you can't play it, if you've got no way of accessing it, if it's sitting on a floppy disk drive or one of those old zip drives or whatever else, or any of these other kinds of dead media that's sitting in a garage somewhere gathering dust, it's as good as gone.
Yeah. Okay, that adds a sort of interesting urgency to the question of exactly how we preserve digital artifacts.
Yep.
That's something the show's concerned about, obviously, with the preservation of digital artworks, media. But then when we start talking about the concept of digital corpses or digital remains, there enters a new ethical dimension into this question. If we are custodians over the digital remains of the dead, do we have an imperative to kind of ensure that these things are preserved?
Yeah, and my argument has been that yes, there should be a default presupposition against deleting.
Yep.
Just because, again, they preserve people in the world, and I think we have a kind of prima facie duty to preserve the dead from oblivion, to preserve them from memory.
Right.
Jeffrey Blustein calls this the rescue from insignificance view, right? The part of what we need to do for the dead is to say, this person lived and they mattered. Right? This person existed, this is who they were, this is how they lived, and they mattered.
Yeah.
The extreme case of that, I guess, would be something like Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. The inscription on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier says, known unto God. Right? And that always struck me as interesting, that there's some sense in which, well, at least God knows who this person was in their concrete specificity, who they really were, how they lived, what mattered to them. God knew what made this person lovable, at least, right? In some ways, that's what we need to do for the dead, is preserve them in their lovability, preserve them as this is a person who mattered, and mattering is linked, I think, to lovability.
Yeah.
And, so preservation then sort of becomes part of that imperative. But it's not going to be absolute, right? There may well be good reasons to delete certain people from the record or to cover them over.
Yeah.
When Jimmy Savile was buried in the UK and he had this huge, big, elaborate tombstone, and then it turned out he was one of the worst sexual predators the country had ever seen, and so they had to then go back and basically demolish the tombstone.
Yeah.
And so there's an interesting thing about how he wiped certain people out of the life world, certain dead people out of the life world. But also, there are cases where some people just find the ongoing presence of the dead so distressing that it might be worth hiding them or deleting them or whatever.
Yeah.
And there's also a legitimate question too for platform providers. I mean, you sign up to Facebook. Facebook has an agreement with you as a living user. You die. Facebook, out of goodness of their heart, you might think, will say, okay, we'll memorialise the profile. They actually do have in fact, not so altruistic reason to do that, which is that by keeping dead people on the network, they keep living people interacting with that dead person's account. So basically, it's just another way of keeping eyeballs on the system. But nonetheless, they don't just delete these things; they keep them online.
Sure.
But Facebook or whoever would be entitled to turn around, and one day they might, and say, you know what, we didn't sign up to be devoting huge amounts of our server space and electricity bill and all this stuff to preserving a whole bunch of people who by definition aren't using our service because they're dead. And there is actually the papers that's come out by Carl Oman and some of his colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute, in which they try to estimate, based on different scenarios, when the dead will outnumber the living in Facebook.
Wow.
And you can do similar things, of course, with each different platform.
Yeah.
And so there will come some point where that occurs, and then it's like, well, hang on, where do the ethical, where do the ethical sort of obligations on service providers finish? At what point can they say, no, hang on, we've done our bit? Are they really, we just wanted to provide a place where people could share photos of cats. We didn't sign on to preserve all these people in perpetuity.
Yeah, exactly.
So that becomes a real problem then, can we offload the work of preserving to someone else? If so, to who has to take carriage of that?
Yeah.
It's easy to look at this stuff and say, oh, well, it costs nothing to preserve a profile, but it costs something. There's a cost somewhere in electricity and server space.
Sure.
It does cost something.
Yeah.
It's not as destructive as something like, Bitcoin mining or whatever, but it's still, but it's still going to have some cost.
Yeah, of course. Okay, that's an interesting point. Yeah, it seems like we need to maybe talk about developing a statute of limitations or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, or, just somehow socialising the cost of preserving people in that way.
That might be better, yeah. Cool. Let's start talking about games in particular, games and memorialisation.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a 2012 paper published by those same scholars we referenced before in the journal Game Studies about the form that memorials have taken in World of Warcraft. And so their discussion is kind of limited to that game, but I think it speaks inadvertently to the increasingly complex nature of memorialisation in games generally. So in the game's early years, memorial practices pretty much translated traditional practices into a virtual space. So there's a memorial to Michel Coiter, an artist who worked on the game and who died during development. So it consists of a stone monument with the angelic form of a spirit healer named Coiter hovering over the body of an orc warrior holding a sword to his breast, laid to rest on a stone plinth with the runes MK, surrounded by grave goods and a totem. Do you think that a virtual sarcophagus like this is meaningfully different to a physical headstone, for instance?
In some ways, I think it's potentially more meaningful in that more people can see it.
Yeah.
One of the big differences, we were talking about the differences a minute ago, and I didn't add this one. One of the big differences between the dead as they were in the pre-digital era and now is that the dead are mixed in amongst the living in a much greater way.
Yeah.
Now. Whereas previously, we still sequester bodies out in graveyards. We take them out to the graveyard and we bury them, or we cremate them and hide them away in a cupboard or on a shelf or whatever.
Sure.
Or inside a columbarium or whatever. Whereas now the dead are much more visibly present in things like our social networks. They're sort of present everywhere. And likewise, when the dead are memorialised in games, they can be present in a way where many, many more people can see that memorialisation. Whether it's a case like that one in World of Warcraft. Subsequently, there's there have been mausoleums built in Minecraft.
Yeah.
And, there's been all sorts of attempts to sort of memorialise people in game like that. What's interesting about that, of course, is that you mentioned the work of Martin Gibbs and Bjorn Nansen, Michael Arnold, Tamara Cohn, and Luc Van Ryn. And one of the things that they talk about is the way in which some people in those game spaces don't really like that. They don't like the idea that these real-world deaths are being sort of imported into what's meant to be a fantasy space, a space free of those kind of concerns. I mean, similar things occurred around funerals in World of Warcraft, and you're going to talk about that? Or
no, go on.
So I don't want to cut across if you're going to talk about that. But
that's cool.
In World of Warcraft, they would have funerals for players who had died in real life.
Yeah.
Which is already a tricky term to use in real life, but
right.
Yeah, but they would have in-game funerals for players who have biologically died, let's say, and then there have been occasions where those funerals have been attacked by other... Is it clans in World of Warcraft? Yeah. So, that was the oldest sounding thing. Is it clans in World of Warcraft? Yeah. Damn, get off my lawn. And this is a real question. On the one hand, you've got people saying, hey, we're actually memorialising an actual dead person. You wouldn't attack a real funeral.
Yeah.
And other people saying, you're bringing this shit into what's meant to be a space for gaming. Right?
Yeah.
They're saying, don't bring your real world stuff in here. We're just here to kill people, but purely in pretense, not in a real way.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting kind of way in which that's contested. And I don't know. My view would be it's a bit of a terrible thing to actually attack a real world. It is a real world funeral. Effectively, these people come together to memorialise, and in attacking it, you are actually being a bit of a jerk.
Of course, you are.
But again, that's partly as much about people trying to just contest what virtual worlds mean.
Yeah.
Does any of this matter?
Yes.
And in what way does it matter?
Yeah. Okay. That's a really interesting point. Well, that sort of stuff, like that the dynamic nature of the kind of funerals in World of Warcraft and the questions that poses surrounding what kind of spaces are we talking about? How do we sequester the dead even in virtual space? Do we need to gate it in some way where the actions are restricted? These are interesting questions.
Yeah.
But there's another way that the dead have been memorialised in World of Warcraft I want to talk about. So the games writer Ian Bogost, he's coined the term procedural rhetoric to describe the capacity for interactive systems, like video games, to persuade or communicate ideas through rule-based procedures, like game mechanics, as distinct from the spoken or written word or images. So WoW reflects this capacity through the memorial to Brad Bridenbecker. So players began a quest to search for the missing Crusader hero, the Crusader Bridenbrad. And upon discovering him, to find that he's deathly ill. So this begins a series of interrelated quests in which, to quote those aforementioned scholars again, quote, the quest chain is a metaphor for a battle with terminal cancer and captures some of the battle cycles of treatment and hope, followed by relapse and resignation, end quote. Do you reckon that this combination of narrative and game mechanics with Memorial indicates a change to the nature of Memorial itself?
I think it's a really interesting way of just re-narrativizing what goes on in cases of death, and in that sense, it's no different to any other artwork.
Sure.
Right. So other forms of artwork narrate death. They narrate the process of death, including the sort of setbacks that you're talking about. Building into game mechanics, in that sense, is just a more participatory form of artwork. But then you might want to say, is there an issue there that it provides, potentially hope where in fact in the real world analog there might not be any such hope, unless the game mechanics completely just defeat any attempt you make to bring about a better outcome, at which point is it a game anymore?
Sure.
So I mean, where do we have to draw a line between those things? I mean, it is interesting that one of the sort of standard criticisms of games in general is that game mechanics don't accurately reflect the sort of existential import of death.
Sure.
Unless they're made to. We had a student around here a couple of years ago who was working on permadeath in games, and on the idea of games in which once you die you can't, in theory at least, play the game again. In practice, of course, there's always a workaround. You can always do it. But,
sure.
But that's an interesting attempt again to try and get the mechanics to reflect an existential reality that's not in your control, and that there are no do-overs in life. You don't respawn.
Yes.
Unless reincarnation turns out to be true, which, at which point, well, it may as well not, given that you don't remember it anyway.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Okay, well, that kind of that issue about reflecting the reality of death. There are a couple of games which really do go above and beyond trying to replicate that. Like, there's the game XCOM, for example. There's a difficulty mode on that game. It's a strategy game called Iron Man, where it's permadeath and there's no manual saving. The game is automatically saving when you do everything.
Yep.
And you can have characters who get killed instantly from full health from a bad dice roll or whatever, and when they're dead, they're gone for good. And they actually do get memorialised. There's like a list of fallen soldiers, and you can see their names and stuff, and they're there forever. So that's an interesting way to go about it, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so for the rest of the show, I want to talk about a specific game, That Dragon Cancer. It's an autobiographical game about two parents, Ryan and Amy Green, raising and grieving for their son, Joel, who died of brain cancer at the age of 5. The game is structured as a series of vignettes, beginning from an unspecified point after Joel's initial diagnosis and proceeding through various stages of treatment, terminal diagnosis, death, and a brief look at an imagined afterlife. In essence, its structure is as if the Crusader Brad questline were expanded into a standalone game. One thing I'd like to mention before we dive into the content is the control scheme, and this comes back to the comments you made about gate crashes and WoW funerals. There's no free movement or action in That Dragon Cancer. All actions in the game are contextual, which is to say that they're governed by a single input, which determines what the player does depending on their current state in the game world. In this game, that means where they're standing and what they're looking at. I was initially baffled by their decision to disallow free movement and action until I read an unrelated article about cyber vandalism of Facebook memorial pages. Suddenly it made sense. One reason the developers may have adapted this control scheme is to prevent players from digitally defacing what is in effect an interactive memorial to their son. Could you talk a little bit about the issues that cyber vandalism of digital memorials pose, and do you think the developers made the right choice?
Yeah, so I think they probably did, to be honest.
Yeah.
What in a slightly earlier iteration was called RIP trolling. I don't know the term's used much anymore, but it is a species of trolling, and like all trolling, it's basically just meaningless nastiness. Well, that's not really true. There are forms of trolling that are quite brilliant, but in general, the sort of trolling I'm thinking of is the type that is just sheer stochastic viciousness.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, what goes on with a lot of memorialisation, or defacing and memorialisations. A lot of that, sometimes when pushed, the people doing that will insist that what they're doing is they're trying to expose what they consider to be inauthentic grief.
Right.
They're trying to say, well, these people don't really know the person who's died or whatever, so, it's not authentic. Or, if it was real grief, they wouldn't be, doing this in public, so to speak. They'd be, alone in their dark room, weeping softly or whatever. So it's just policing other people's behaviour and how they grieve, and at best. But really, that stuff's just post facto rationalisation for just, I'm an asshole and I want to do this. I just want to upset someone.
Exactly.
So I think in the case of That Dragon Cancer, they were right, I think, to try and close off the possibility of that, because when you expose yourself to that many people, there will be a number of people who will want to hurt irrationally.
Yeah.
And, people that have lost a child, I think, have probably already, suffered enough without having to go through that sort of additional stuff. Kierkegaard, who's the guy I do a lot of my work on, 19th century Danish philosopher, talks about the media in his time as a form of disproportionate communication. I'm giving a paper on this in Japan week after next. Disproportionate here meaning that you're speaking to too many people at once.
Right.
When you speak to that many people at once, you can't really communicate on the proper sort of level. And we see that online in things like pylons, where even when someone probably deserves it, even when someone says something really horrible, they probably deserve to be told you just said something horrible.
Yeah.
But when 6,000 people are all trying to tell them at once that they've done something really horrible, then you create something that's disproportionate just because of the way the communication works. It's too far beyond the bounds of one-on-one or one-on-a-few communication.
Sure.
In the same sort of way, if you put something like That Dragon Cancer out there, it's going to be seen by so many people that there are going to be people who are going to react in a way that, for whatever reason they wanted to subvert the whole thing or destroy the whole thing, and will end up doing so in ways that are just, psychopathic.
Yeah, okay, I get you. It seems like with the pylon stuff, the people contributing may imagine their communication as one-on-one, so they individually are responding individually to this wrong.
Yeah,
but there's an aggregate effect of everyone doing it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just about sheer numbers.
Yeah.
And not. It's not even about whether each individual engagement, as you say, may be perfectly legitimate on its own terms. But it's just the sheer fact of volume.
Yeah.
That makes a difference there.
Okay. There's the vignette which opens the game is of the Green family at a park. The player, from Joel's point of view, throws bread to a duck in a lake while his brothers, who voice themselves incidentally, ask their parents why Joel can't talk despite nearly being 5. The parents dance around the word cancer, shifting the conversation away from what he can't do to what he is good at. The unanimous verdict is that he's good at enjoying life, but this is something the player knows before they're told, as they've been making him laugh and watching him clap his hands with glee at the duck while the conversation plays out. Later, as Ryan Green, you play with Joel on a playground while audio clips taken from the Greens' actual outings with their kids come through, slightly distorted. You can hear Joel in them. You can hear him laughing. With the focusing gameplay on Joel's happiness in life, the opening seeks to convey through experience the modern understanding of the purpose of Memorial, that is, to celebrate a life. Has that always been the dominant conception of Memorial?
No, I don't think so. And in fact, I found that was about as far into it as I could get. Yeah. Actually, just even in walkthrough, because it was just so harrowing. Because, and this is always a thing when you make these things post facto, it's shot through with knowing what's going to happen, right? And you can tell, you can hear in their voices that there's a real what's going to happen. But they say things where it's like, oh no, he'll learn to read one day, he'll catch up, and you're thinking they've got to know that he's not going to. They've got to know what's going to happen. So it's shot through that kind of irony, which makes it quite painful in a way. I don't know that memorials have always been about celebrating life in quite that way.
Yep.
Or at least not all, but some certainly were.
Yeah.
And a lot of memorials were just about about memory. They're about actually kind of physically embodying the person in memory in a way that's going to sort of survive. Go right back to the Romans, right? The Romans would have these parades where they would wear masks with the face of the likeness of their ancestors, right? So what the person looked like is preserved in that way. If you look at a lot of Victorian era photography, like family photographs, very often there'll be photos with the whole family posed around a newly deceased person. And particularly if that was a child or was a very old person and photography just come in, that may well be the only photo they would have of that person. Yeah. So those photos were the only way of preserving the phenomenality of that person, what that person looked like, and the physicality among them. And again, something like that Dragon Cancer, I think, is in that tradition where it's kind of it's narrativizing and it's trying to send forward different sorts of messages, and it's also trying to do this immersive thing that a typical memorial can't do, of trying to convey some of the sort of confusion and pain and so on of what they're going through. But it's also, in a way of preserving Joel as a phenomenal being, as a distinctive being who lived in the world. Yeah.
One of the key devices that games use to tell stories is often known as mechanic as metaphor. This term means when a gameplay system is set up to represent a concept or an element of real-world experience, to kind of communicate emotions and real concepts that way. That Dragon Cancer utilises it in a dream sequence in which, having fallen asleep in Joel's hospital room, you control Joel, suspended in the air by a bunch of balloons as blackened tumours drift towards him from the horizon. The player moves Joel left and right to evade the tumours, and if Joel makes contact with a tumour, one of the balloons bursts with a loud sound. Initially, it's easy to stay away from them, but as the sequence progresses, the tumours are coming so thick and fast it's impossible to dodge them, and the player is forced, despite their best efforts, to watch as Joel's balloons are destroyed, after which the dream ends. When I first played the game, every time a balloon popped, I jumped in my seat. I'd fully internalised the metaphor and felt on the level of my bodily interaction with the game Ryan's despairing desperation in trying to protect his son. I had that kind of paternal instinct. In the book A Very Easy Death, a memoir about her mother's death from cancer, Simone de Beauvoir writes about feeling paralysed at the deathbed, about being alongside but unable to enter into the suffering of her mother. Do you think that by using tools like mechanic as metaphor, Memorial Games may be able to bridge that gap she articulates?
To some extent, yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly that they can make that suffering more kind of real in a sense. But again, the mechanics are going to pick out particular kind of aspects of it.
Yeah.
They can't make you actually feel pain, but they can make you feel hopelessness or dejection or whatever. But only in a way it's only ever sort of partial, because you can always walk away from it.
True.
There is a point that's sometimes talked about, in terms of what happens when you engage with a fiction, but you feel the sort of emotions that would be appropriate to the fiction if it were really occurring. Recantly Furtak, who's a colleague of mine, sometimes talks about this in terms of what's the term he uses? Something like experiencing emotions that are not assented to, right? So in other words, or entertaining emotions that are not assented to. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm having these emotional experiences, right? With this kind of as if aspect to them, right?
Sure.
So it's as if this is really happening, but I know that they're not really happening. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm simultaneously experiencing them, but at the same time I'm also kind of aware that it's not really happening in the same sort of way. One thing I don't think that games can quite get across is the inescapability of finding yourself in these situations, where it's not simply a matter of, oh, this is terrible, I can't save or I can't bring about a different outcome here.
Yeah.
But also, and this is my reality and there's no getting out of it.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing that you can't quite... Well, there'd certainly be no ethical way of bringing that about that a game could do that. So.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Yeah, I think it's probably important to point out limitations as well. But there is a real question in which that sort of limitation seems almost intrinsic. Like, as I said, without crossing very serious ethical boundaries, there's a question as to whether any artwork could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
And here's an interesting dimension. With reference to, you've mentioned a couple of times, preservation is keeping about or memorialization is preserving the phenomenality of the dead. One interesting thing about that Dragon Cancer is that Joel's model has no facial features.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is relevant to the question I've got to ask you. So that Dragon Cancer was partially funded by a Kickstarter campaign. And those who pledged above a certain amount could submit short text or image-based memorials of their own to be featured in certain scenes. There's a later scene where you're walking through a hospital and there's a whole bunch of art on the walls. That's all provided by Kickstarter backers.
Right.
Yeah. So there's a scene after an exasperated Amy talks about her experiences in caring for Joel whilst rocking him in a hospital chair. The player notices that there are a few greeting cards in the room. You pick up the cards and you read them, and they reveal the messages left by the game's Kickstarter backers, written messages this time. Almost all tributes to relatives or friends who've died of cancer. This makes sense. When the player chooses to leave the room, they discover that every surface from the hall leading to the exit is covered with those cards. Just seeing all those cards and knowing what they say in them blows you away.
Yeah.
Yeah. They don't have to...
I have an analogue to that, actually.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah?
There's a synagogue in Prague, which has been converted into a memorial for everyone who died at Terezin, which was the death camp in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
As was. And on the walls of one of the main rooms, they've written the names and date of birth and date of death of I think it's like 10,000 people that died at Terezin. And the sheer effect of just seeing how many of those names there are on every square inch of surface, that in itself, just again, scale is kind of the thing. Like on the one hand, you've got each one of those is a name, each one's a person, each one has that kind of distinctive mattering that they have. And then you step back and it's just this overwhelming volume of them. That's really quite incredibly powerful. And the next room, they had when we were there at least, they had a selection of artwork that had been made by kids in Terezin.
Shit.
So you're seeing each individual child's sort of artwork.
Oh my god.
And then it's got who they were and when they died, basically. And there's like one kid in there that survived, that's in that list of artwork. God. And they say something like, this many thousand children went into Terezin and, I think 30 or something survived. I can't remember the exact figure now. It was a long time ago. But, but again, there is a thing about combining really, really concrete, personal, specific details, and then panning out and seeing just how many of those there are. There is a particular effect in that I think is quite important.
Yeah. Man, that's...
It's the same effect, I think, that you're describing.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
It seems that it's important that both of them, in the virtual sense and in the real sense, are phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
You can say 10,000 dead, and you have the idea, you can imagine it to a certain degree, but it's quite another thing to see 10,000 names written on a wall.
Yeah.
Yeah, or to see a whole bunch of greeting cards with testimonies in them.
Exactly.
Yeah. The player doesn't have to read any of the cards, after all. They can just make a beeline to the door at the end of the hall if they want. But last time I played, I read every single one of them.
Oh, well.
And I was a complete hysterical, sobbing mess at the end of it. So, you know, if they wanted to... If a player didn't want to read any of your cards, they'd be keeping the scope of the story focused on the particular family, on the Green family, in much the same way that A Very Easy Death is laser-focused on the de Beauvoirs, right? But if you read all the cards, suddenly... I think the affect of the game is potentially changed, because Joel's faceless model ceases to represent a single boy, or purely, and seems to point beyond himself at something more universal. Do you think that this is unique, or is every memorial in some sense universal?
There is a sense in which every memorial calls out beyond itself, and calls out to the person, right? So, I mean, if you look at 17th century memorials, they very often have that, you know, as I once was, now shall you be, therefore prepare to follow me, right?
Yeah.
Which in a way is kind of this like, oh wow, yes, I too shall die, but it's perfectly generic.
Sure.
Right? It's completely generic. But there is this interesting thing about the way in which every death is simultaneously an absolutely unique event, and also stands in for the human condition as such, that we all die, and therefore affects every person individually by throwing them back on their own death.
Right.
I mean, one of the criticisms that has been made of that dragon cancer, to the extent that anyone has the stomach to criticise it, one of the criticisms that's been made is just that it becomes so specific to that family's individualised sort of suffering, even though it also contains all these things that point beyond that and point to the generic nature of that kind of how we die now. We die in hospital rooms that all look the same, and you know, the mechanics all look the same.
Sure.
But, you know, there is a sense in which, you know, there's something really kind of specific and concrete about that. And some people say that makes it kind of hard to identify. But I was thinking, when I read that particular criticism, I was thinking of, and I talk about this passage all the time, but there's a pivotal scene in The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, where Ilyich realises he's dying. He understands now that he's dying, and he's thinking back to when he was at school, and he says, you know, when they taught us logic, they taught us, you know, all men are mortal, Caius is a man, therefore Caius is mortal. He said, well, that seems perfectly fine insofar as Caius goes, but it's got nothing to do with me. Right? It's perfectly fine that Caius should die, but not me.
Yeah.
You know, and he says, did Caius feel the rustle of his mother's skirts like that? What does Caius know of the striped leather ball, the smell of the striped leather ball? Did Caius riot at school over how bad the food was, like the way I did?
Yeah.
Did Caius, you know, was Caius ever in love the way I was, right? And what's fascinating to me about that scene is that he's looking at all these irreducibly concrete particulars. You know, these are the things that make up me, little Vanya, right? Ivan Ilyich. These are the things that make up me, that are specific to me.
Yep.
What does Caius, man in the abstract, or humans in the abstract, have to do with that? And again, there's that interesting thing that if you're going to really tell a death rather than the fact of death as such, you have to get at that level of things that maybe only mean things to the people directly involved.
Yeah.
But that simultaneously also do stand in for every individual's reality of going to die. So
yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, communicate the universal through the particular.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's pretty cool. This, where That Dragon Cancer has been criticised somewhat, some of it has to do with the game's heavy religious framing. The Greens are a very devout family, and the game represents the struggle of cancer from a fundamentally Christian perspective. After the scene in which Joel is terminally diagnosed, the game world floods, so there's some biblical symbolism for you, and fades out. After the game fades back in, the Greens' parents are separated. So Amy is in a canoe on the surface of the water. She's holding Joel in one hand, and she's controlling the boat with the other. And Ryan is submerged beneath the water. He's motionless between these gigantic tumours which pulse to the rhythm of a heartbeat. On the surface of the water are messages in bottles, a series of which detail Amy's drive to remain faithful through doubt and believe that God will ensure that Joel will live. Ryan, on the other hand, expects and believes only that Joel will die, seemingly accepting that it's God's will. As a non-religious person, I found Amy's testimony completely baffling until one of her letters used the phrase fear and trembling, which, here you go, you know what's coming, which brought to mind the book of the same name by Kierkegaard.
Yes.
A person with whom you are intimately familiar.
Yeah, okay.
Looking at all these books on your shelf.
Yes, no.
Could you please explain to my listeners what Kierkegaard understands faith to mean in that book?
Well, in a way, he ends up saying that faith is incomprehensible, almost. So it's built around the biblical account that we know as the Akedah narrative. So the story of God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac.
Yeah.
So take him up to Mount Moriah and sacrifice him. While they're up there, Isaac's like, well, where's the lamb? What's going on?
Yeah.
And Abraham's like, God will provide the lamb. And then they get there, and he's like, I'm sorry, you're the lamb. God tells me to sacrifice. Isaac's like, well, if that's what God wants, go ahead.
Sure.
And then Abraham's just about to kill him, and then an angel appears and says, stop. This was a test or whatever, or you don't have to do it. Here's a ram caught in some thickets. You can sacrifice the ram instead.
Yep.
There's a Family Guy scene actually where they talk about this, and it's just one of those cutaway jokes, and it's Abraham walking back down the hill carrying a knife, and Isaac behind him going, "You want to tell me what the fuck that was?" I just love that moment. I thought, yeah, well, it would be a really awkward walk home.
Oh yeah.
But so Kierkegaard's problem with this is he says this is meant to be the paradigm of faith. Right, this is meant to be what Abraham is the father of faith. This is the fact that he's willing to do what God tells him to do here. He says that's meant to be the example that Christians are meant to live by. But he says, in human terms, it's incomprehensible. Right? It makes no sense. And it literally seems to be incomprehensible because, and this actually comes back to what you're talking about in the game, Abraham simultaneously believes that he will kill Isaac and that Isaac won't be taken from him.
Right.
There are these incompatible beliefs that are incomprehensible to an outsider. And the figure of Johannes de Silentio, who is the figure who's telling the story, so to speak, basically says, well, it can't be this and it can't be that. It can't be the case that he's sacrificing him for a higher ethical purpose, because there isn't an ethical purpose in this. Rather, the ethical is comprehensible, right? So when Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia, it's for a higher ethical purpose, so the Athenian fleet can sail and sack Troy. He says that's not what's going on here. He can at least explain to people around him why he did it, even if ultimately his wife Clytemnestra doesn't agree and she kills him. But he can explain it. He can make himself understood. Abraham can't make himself understood.
No.
He cannot make what's going on clear. And in the end, De Silentio sort of throws his hands up and says, I can't understand Abraham. I just can't. Humanly speaking, we have to regard him as either insane or a criminal. He said, so I can't understand. And so there's this point that in a way faith is always beyond the ability of the faithful person to translate that faith into universal terms, that is, in terms that everyone can understand. So that's kind of what's going on there. So in a way that sounds like it's mapping onto what's going on almost in that structure of simultaneously believing that Joel will live and believing that Joel will die. At some point that becomes impossible for the bystander to completely understand, but that doesn't invalidate it as a part of people's actual lived experience.
No, of course not. It reminded me in particular of the section in Fear and Trembling when he talks about the nights of infinite resignation and the night of faith. So the night of infinite resignation, who just sort of says, oh well, everything's over, whatever, sort of thing, and just gives things up, right? And so would give up Isaac in that case. Seems to me that's Ryan.
Well, yeah, it does seem like that. Whereas the night of faith simultaneously gives everything up and gets everything back. So maybe Job rather than Abraham almost, but Abraham's sort of still the paradigm here. But the interesting thing about that is the way, Fear and Trembling, written in the early 1840s, there's this sense in which the night of faith is just a little too self-satisfied. He's a guy who's he says, "Oh, here, now let's talk about the Knight of Faith. What it look like now? It's a guy sitting on a park bench who's just a tax collector. He's his job. He's like a minor civic official. He's sitting on a park bench, wondering what his wife is going to have for him for dinner when he gets home. He's hoping it's a roast, and when he gets home, it's nothing that good. He's not too upset. He's still okay. Well, fair enough.
Sure.
It's like so. It's really kind of fascinating in a way that the best Di Salentio come up with is this incredibly bourgeois, comfortable guy. And then you compare that with what Kierkegaard was writing 10 years after that, where it's all like, bring it all down, humans all need to be allowed to die out because fornication's a sin, and the church is made up of cannibals, and they're watering down Christianity to make it palatable for people. And
oh wow,
so it's this there's a definite kind of evolution in Kierkegaard's thought there, which Kierkegaard scholars don't like talking about so much, and we tend to sort of ignore the 1854-55 writings because it's like, he just went a bit off the deep end towards the very end there. It's nothing to worry about. In fact, it's not. In some ways, it's kind of like the natural progression of where he's going. He starts off by talking about the Knight of Faith, and in the end, he realises what the Knight of Faith actually has to do, which is basically be destroyed by the world.
Yeah, well, they can't understand him. What else are they meant to do? Yeah, exactly. One final thing about that Dragon Cancer I want to talk about is about the reason you stopped playing is how horrific memoirs of a person struggling with cancer are by necessity to a certain degree, right?
Yeah.
Inevitably, the focus at some point turns toward what cancer does to the body, and that's never good. And this game is no exception. There's a sequence called Dehydration. It's a way of Ryan explaining his infinite resignation of giving Joel up for dead. You play as Ryan on a bad night in the hospital. Joel begins crying and screaming in agony, and there's nothing you can do. You can walk around the room, interacting with everything you can. Nothing will calm him down. You can't leave the room. You have to sit there for at least 5 minutes while the child in front of you is screeching in torment. And when I played this game, this sequence obliterated me. The game formally represents the impotence in the face of suffering that many accounts of cancer describe, and is expressed best by de Beauvoir, I think, in A Very Easy Death. The horror of that sequence brings to mind what is sometimes called the paradox of tragedy or painful art. I think that Dragon Cancer is a brilliant game, and that sequence in particular for its formal cleverness, but how can I say that when it's just so horrible to experience?
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes brilliant things are unpleasant to experience, and that's part of the brilliance, right? I mean, it's so horrible to experience that kind of impotence and that kind of, inevitability, I guess.
Yeah.
But at the same time, well, that's what it is, and if you come away from that understanding cancer a bit better, then so much the better. The interesting question is whether anyone would play it twice.
I've played it 3 times.
Oh, okay. Well, that answers that.
Well, yeah.
Would it have been the sort of thing like, oh man, I've had a hard day, I'm just going to unwind by, playing a game about a dying child?
No, I played it the first time for the experience, and I played it the other 2 times to prepare for the show.
Right. So I mean, there are games that exist that aren't meant to be sort of played multiple times,
exactly,
for fun sort of thing.
Yeah.
That Penn and Teller one with the bus that you've got to drive.
Oh my gosh! I'm not sure the game was even meant to be played once.
No, but yeah, I mean, it's again, you could say that's part of the the way in which games have come into their own as a medium for expressing a whole bunch of different kind of artistic purposes.
Yeah.
That if you can make someone sit through something that's almost completely unbearable. And again, the use of the mechanics is a good way to do that. That may even be more effective than just doing it through a movie or whatever else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a game that I bring up all the time with reference to this. It's Papers, Please. Have you ever heard of it?
No.
Yeah, it's been referred to as a bureaucracy em-up. I know, it's awesome. You play as a guard in a fictional Soviet bloc country manning a border checkpoint. And the gameplay is you sit in your little cubicle and people hand their passports through a little slit, and you have to analyse the passports, check them against the rule book and stuff. Every day, there's like a day-night cycle. You get paid for processing people at a certain speed. You use the money to maintain your family at home, right?
Right.
So it's simulating the bureaucratic mode of life, right? And so you have...
First-person administrator.
Exactly, right? And it simulates also the kind of weirdness of some of the Soviet experience, because you get a newspaper briefing every day of the political events going on in the nearby countries. And what it basically means for you is you get increasingly labyrinthine and contradictory sets of rules and additions. Every day, someone is always coming to your thing and saying, oh, we're at war with this country now, you have to do this, slow things down, do that. Guards come up and they say, look, I'm on the take. I'll split some of it with you if you help me process these sorts of people, stuff like that. And so you're forced to kind of like... The gameplay systems represent for you the formal choice of adhering to irrational authority versus being a consistent ethical person and dealing with the consequences of your resistance, right? Yeah. So that's particularly interesting, I think, on that level.
That's cool, yeah. In terms of admin ones, I did recently find myself playing... I do sometimes like to play like really old, like late 80s, early 90s games that have been repurposed or, been saved through Java and things. And so I recently found myself playing 13th Floor, which is...
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, which is like a late 80s British game where you're basically the head of like a secret intelligence agency in the UK that secretly controls everything, and so you're just sitting there going, assassinate that person, ransack that person's house, or whatever. But it's basically just management. It's just like managing the budget. You're sitting there just looking at files and clicking this action and that action, and then eventually the Prime Minister will either promote you or fire you, or you'll get thrown out the window like your predecessor. But it's pure administration, which is kind of not, I don't know. I wouldn't come home and fire up Marking Simulator or something.
No, I don't think you'd need to. No. So, to kind of close this out, do games like That Dragon Cancer and how mourning practices have been incorporated into World of Warcraft make you optimistic about the future of digital memorial?
Yeah, I think that human creativity is a pretty remarkable thing, and mourning in a funny sort of way has been one of the more interestingly productive impetuses in human life. Samuel Morse got a message while he was in Washington doing a painting that his wife was dying, so he jumped on a horse and rode back home to Baltimore or whatever, and by the time he got the message she was already dead, and by the time he got home she'd been buried. A decade later, Morse invents the telegraph. Right. Which had actually sort of already been invented in England, but Morse invents and demonstrates the telegraph. Now, we don't know for sure that was kind of a work of mourning, but it's not hard to look at it and say, well, that's Samuel going, we need instant communication because maybe I could have come back and seen my wife before she died if we'd had better communication. So, there's a sense in which, grief, for all of its destructiveness, for all the way it eats at people, and it nonetheless can be a very productive thing. And we've seen that already in the games space. We've seen a lot of really interesting ways in which people have been able to memorialise the dead in a way that's quite direct and quite, honest. And I mentioned Minecraft mausoleums earlier. They're huge, and the sheer amount of work that's involved is part of it too. It's not magic. Levinas once said that magic is basically the idea of labour without effort. It's instantaneous. Sure. This isn't that. No. It takes a very long time to do this stuff, and so there's a sense in which that is an old and recognisable part of the human heritage, but it's also something that I think optimism is a good word. I think that there's good reason to think that if you give people these technologies, there are terrible things they can do with them, but there will also be works of love, to use a Care Guardian phrase, that will be taken up in that space. Yeah, well, it definitely seems like that kind of labour demonstrates our regard for the dead, right? If we're going to build a mausoleum in Minecraft or do any sort of work of love, then that kind of seems that we're saying that they're worthy of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much for being on the show, Patrick. Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. Beautiful. Hello again, everyone. It's Liam here with some footnotes for you. I wanted to read from A Very Easy Death by Simone de Beauvoir first. And this passage, the first passage I want to read, is about cancer and the body. It kind of has something to do with that last fragment of the game that I mentioned, Dehydration, which is sort of about that. It's one of the few
segments involving Joel directly, which doesn't actually depict him bodily for the most part. And I think that partially was a choice made to make that sequence a bit less horrific, because I cannot communicate to you just how distressing it is to sit there, be completely impotent, clicking on everything, trying to solve a puzzle to figure out what I can do to calm this boy. But the developers have used the same trick that the developers of the Stanley Parable did with the countdown button to the standard ending, where you trigger the self-destruct sequence in the building, and you're running around, all these buttons and panels appeared, and you're running around furiously trying to find the right one to abort the sequence. And then the narrator calls you out for it. It's like, look at you running around, pressing every button, trying to find, the sequence to avert it, but they're all useless. There is nothing you can do. So the game was setting you up using video game tropes and mechanics to underline not your agency, but your impotence, and how the futility of your efforts. And so with taking, it's one thing to make a kind of haha postmodern reference to the fact that the agency of players is circumscribed by developers, but it's quite another thing to use that acknowledgement to as a metaphor, using mechanic as a metaphor for the futility of the attempt to alleviate the suffering of a child who is dying from brain cancer, and as a result, given that Joel can't speak or talk properly, can't even articulate their own suffering. It's literally not meaningless. Well, the screams are meaningless, but they are not for no reason. The screams are communicating in a manner that is pure, simultaneously below and above the level of language, just how awful the suffering that he is going through is. So here is a little section from A Very Easy Death about her mother, who was dying from cancer. Her mother, at this point, I believe, is 77. So it's almost the opposite to Joel's experience. You have a child who hasn't yet developed language, and a woman very much at the end of a normal lifespan for the time. Quote, "But I turned away and gazed fixedly into the garden. The sight of my mother's nakedness had jarred me. Nobody existed less for me. None existed more. As a child, I had loved it dearly. As an adolescent, it had filled me with an uneasy repulsion. All this was perfectly in the ordinary course of things, and it seemed reasonable to me that her body should retain its dual nature, that it should be both repugnant and holy, a taboo. But for all that, I was astonished at the violence of my distress. My mother's indifferent acquiescence made it worse. She was abandoning the exigencies and prohibitions that had oppressed her all her life long, and I approved of her doing so. Only this body, suddenly reduced by her capitulation to being a body and nothing more, hardly differed at all from a corpse. A poor defenceless carcass turned and manipulated by professional hands, one in which life seemed to carry on only because of its own stupid momentum. For me, my mother had always been there, and I had never seriously thought that someday, that soon, I should see her go. Her death, like her birth, had its place in some legendary time. When I said to myself, 'She is of an age to die,' the words were devoid of meaning, as so many words are. For the first time, I saw her as a dead body under suspended sentence." For this next bit that I want to read, I was debating whether or not I wanted to put some audio taken from that dragon cancer in here to exemplify the point and to heighten the contrast and analogies that I want to suggest between these two works. But ultimately, I felt that it would undermine in some sense the affect of the game. And if there's one thing that I want you to do, if you haven't played the game, I would urge you to try it. There are plenty of people who I know personally who have told about the game and who were never going to play it, partially because cancer for them is something that is too real. It's something that has afflicted them personally, either in themselves or in a close family member. And so I can totally understand that. They don't need to understand what it is to witness someone go through that process. They've lived it. But for those of us who, like me, have been pretty lucky on that front, that dragon cancer was something of an eye-opener. So I really do encourage anyone who feels that they are up to it to give it a go. And, to support the developers, because, I think that they deserve support, and their work needs to be acknowledged, I think, because it is significant. With regard to the history of the medium, with regard to demonstrating what the medium is capable of, to being one demonstration among many, I think that dragon cancer is something that should be talked about a bit more. So I was going to play a clip from the dehydration. Partially, I don't want to do it because it would require me playing it again, and as I've mentioned in the episode, I've played this game 3 fucking times. I don't necessarily want to, even though I can just skip directly to the chapter, I don't want to sit through those minutes of hearing that child scream again. I think I've had more than enough of that. So I'm just going to read the quote from A Very Easy Death, and I would encourage you to play the game, and then when you play that segment, hopefully you will understand what this means. Poupette, who is de Beauvoir's sister, by the way, was living on her nerves. My blood pressure mounted. A pulse throbbed in my head. What tried us more than anything were Maman's death agonies, her resurrections, and our own inconsistency. In this race between pain and death, we most earnestly hoped that death would come first. Yet when Maman was asleep with her face lifeless, we would anxiously gaze at the white bed jacket to catch the faint movement of the black ribbon that held her watch. Dread of the last spasm gripped us by the throat. A few pages later, at 6:30 she took some soup and custard, and it gave her pleasure. Then suddenly she cried out, a burning pain in her left buttock. It was not at all surprising. Her flayed body was bathing in the uric acid that oozed from her skin. The nurses burnt their fingers when they changed her draw sheet. I rang and rang, panic-stricken. How the interminable seconds dragged out. I held Maman's hand. I stroked her forehead. I talked. They will give you an injection. It won't hurt any more. Just 1 minute more. Only 1 minute. All tense, on the edge of shrieking, she moans, "It burns. It's awful. I can't stand it. I can't bear it any longer." And half sobbing, "I'm so utterly miserable," in that child's voice that pierced me to the heart. How completely alone she was. I touched her. I talked to her. But it was impossible to enter into her suffering. My heart took to beating madly. Her eyes turned back. I thought, she is dying. And she murmured, "I'm going to faint." At last Madame Gontran gave her an injection of morphia. It did not work. I rang again. I was terrified by the idea that the pain might have started in the morning, when Maman had no one with her and no means of calling anyone. There was no longer any question of leaving her alone for a moment. This time the nurses gave Maman Equinil, changed her draw sheet, and put an ointment on her open places that left a metallic sheen on their hands. The burning went off. It had lasted only a quarter of an hour. An eternity. He shrieked for hours. "It's stupid," said Maman. "It's so stupid." Yes, so stupid as to make one weep. I could no longer understand the doctors, nor my sister, nor myself. Nothing on earth could possibly justify these moments of pointless torment. So that's the end of that little section. The next thing I want to talk about is something we touched on briefly in the podcast, which is the heavy religious content in the game, something that becomes more pronounced once you reach the halfway point, which I kind of identify as the scene with terminal diagnosis. And it's not at all, though, like, traditional Protestant Christianity as it is expressed in its most popular forms here in the developed Anglophone countries. Because it doesn't focus upon the afterlife. It's very curious in that a lot of Christian discussion about those who suffer from cancer points to the world beyond. That even if God does not miraculously intervene to save the person from cancer, that they will find their peace in the hereafter. But that's almost not discussed in the game. It's referenced here and there, and the epilogue is a kind of imagining of Joel in the afterlife. But that, for the most of the discussion, that's not it. The discussion is on keeping him alive. And as an atheist, the thing I found baffling was that surely death in heaven would be better. Like, you would wish that on someone who was going through something so horrible and for which there was no hope of recovery. But a passage in Very Easy Death, and this is the importance of engaging with fictions, because fictions, works of art, can hit you with a sort of... They can open your mind to a point of view, engage you empathetically in such a way to actually transform your conceptions. After playing That Dragon Cancer, and after reading A Very Easy Death, I understood the mindset of a person who thinks in a way that's fundamentally different from me a lot more. I understood it and I can accept it. And here is a passage that helped to illuminate this greatly for me. "I can't understand," said the bewildered Mademoiselle Vautier. "Your mother is so religious and so pious, and yet she's so afraid of death. Did she not know that the saints died convulsed and shrieking? Besides, Maman was not afraid of either God or the devil, only of leaving this earth. My grandmother had known perfectly well that she was dying. Contentedly she said, 'I am going to eat one last little boiled egg, and then I am going to join Gustave again.' She had never put much passion into living. At 84 she was gloomily vegetating. Dying did not disturb or vex her. My father showed no less courage. 'Ask your mother not to get a priest to come,' he said to me. 'I don't want to act a part.' And he gave instructions on certain practical matters. Ruined, embittered, he accepted the void with the same serenity that Grandmamma had accepted paradise. Maman loved life as I love it, and in the face of death she had the same feeling of rebellion that I have. During her last days, I received many letters with remarks on my most recent book. 'If you had not lost your faith, death would not terrify you so,' wrote the devout, with rancorous commiseration. Well-intentioned readers urged, 'Disappearing is not of the least importance. Your works will remain.' And inwardly, I told them they were all wrong. Religion could do no more for my mother than the hope of posthumous success could do for me. Whether you think of it as heavenly or as earthly, if you love life, immortality is no consolation for death." One thing that certainly comes across in the many clips that seem to be taken from actual outings with the Greens, with their other sons, on trips, and there's one particular section with what sounds like a bedtime story that was rather touching. The Green family, despite their belief in another world, in a better world beyond, they love life, and so their pain becomes comprehensible to me as an idea, not just as an instinct, but it becomes coherent and understandable to me. So the fault was not on them. The fault was not theirs. The fault was mine. But engaging with these fictions allowed me to correct that, and allowed me to understand another human being in a way that I couldn't before. And so I feel very grateful. One last passage I want to read to you is about the kind of the inherently violent nature of death as a disruptive force. So this is the end paragraph of the book, actually. "You do not die from being born, or from having lived, or from old age. You die from something. The knowledge that because of her age my mother's life must soon come to an end did not lessen the horrible surprise. She had sarcoma, cancer, thrombosis, pneumonia. It is as violent and unforeseen as an engine stopping in the middle of the sky. My mother encouraged one to be optimistic when, crippled with arthritis and dying, she asserted the infinite value of each instant. But her vain tenaciousness also ripped and tore the reassuring curtain of everyday triviality. There is no such thing as a natural death. Nothing that happens to a man is ever natural, since his presence calls the world into question. All men must die, but for every man his death is an accident, and even if he knows it and consents to it, an unjustifiable violation." That brings to mind the section from The Death of Ivan Ilyich that Patrick references in the episode, where he's referencing that classic syllogism, all men are mortal, Caius is mortal, therefore Caius must die. Saying, it's very well for Caius, but what about me? The inner truth of death is something that has to be grappled with on a phenomenal level, I think. Before I leave you kind folks, I'd like to read a slightly longer section but it is one section this time, not a bunch of smaller sections, from Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard. This is about his figures of the Night of Infinite Resignation and the Night of Faith, which he uses to illustrate two attitudes towards belief and desire. And he sort of does this by a fictional sketch, so I'll read that to you now. A young lad falls in love with a princess. The content of his whole life lies in this love, and yet the relationship is one that cannot possibly be brought to fruition, be translated from ideality into reality. The slaves of misery, the frogs in life's swamp, naturally exclaim, "Such love is foolishness. The rich brewer's widow is just as good and sound a match." Let them croak away undisturbed in the swamp. This is not the manner of the Night of Infinite Resignation. He does not renounce the love, not for all the glory in the world. He is no trifler. He first makes sure that this really is the content of his life, and his soul is too healthy and proud to squander the least thing on getting drunk. He is not cowardly. He is not afraid to let his love steal in upon his most secret, most hidden thoughts, to let it twine itself in countless coils around every ligament of his consciousness. If his love becomes unhappy, he will never be able to wrench himself out of it. He feels a blissful rapture when he lets it tingle through every nerve, and yet his soul is as solemn as his who has emptied the cup of poison and feels the juice penetrate to every drop of blood. For this moment is life and death. Having thus imbibed all the love and absorbed himself in it, he does not lack the courage to attempt and risk everything. He reflects over his life circumstances. He summons the swift thoughts that, like trained doves, obey his every signal. He waves his rod over them, and they rush off in all directions. But now, when they all return as messengers of sorrow and explain to him that it is an impossibility, he becomes quiet. He dismisses them, he remains alone, and he performs the movement. For the knight will then, in the first place, have the strength to concentrate the whole of his life's content and meaning of reality in a single wish. If a person lacks this concentration, this focus, his soul is disintegrated from the start, and then he will never come to make the movement. He will act prudently in life, like those capitalists who invest their capital in every kind of security, so as to gain on the one what they lose on the other. In short, he is not a knight. Secondly, the knight will have the strength to concentrate the whole of the result of his reflection into one act of consciousness. If he lacks this focus, his soul is disintegrated from the start, and he will then never have time to make the movement. He will be forever running errands in life, never enter the eternal. For at the very moment he is almost there, he will suddenly discover that he has forgotten something and must go back. The next moment he will think it possible, and that is also quite correct. But through such considerations, one never comes to make the movement. Rather, with their help, one sinks ever deeper into the mire. So the knight makes the movement. But what movement? Does he want to forget the whole thing? Because in that too there is a kind of concentration. No, for the knight does not contradict himself, and it is a contradiction to forget the whole of one's life's content and still be the same. He has no inclination to become another, seeing nothing at all great in that prospect. Only lower natures forget themselves and become something new. Thus the butterfly has altogether forgotten that it was a caterpillar. Perhaps it can so completely forget in turn that it was a butterfly that it can become a fish. Deeper natures never forget themselves and never become something other than they were. So the knight will remember everything, but the memory is precisely the pain, and yet in his infinite resignation he is reconciled with existence. His love for the princess would take on for him the expression of an eternal love, would acquire a religious character, be transfigured into a love for the eternal being which, although it denied fulfillment, still reconciled him once more in the eternal consciousness of his love's validity, in an eternal form that no reality can take from him. Fools and young people talk about everything being possible for a human being. But that is a great mistake. Everything is possible spiritually speaking, but in the finite world there is much that is not possible. This impossibility the knight nevertheless makes possible by his expressing it spiritually, but he expresses it spiritually by renouncing it. The desire which would convey him out into reality but came to grief on an impossibility, now bends inwards, but is not lost thereby, nor forgotten. At times it is the unconscious workings of the desire in him which awaken the memory. At others it is he himself that awakens it, for he is too proud to want to let the whole content of his life seem to have been but a fleeting affair of the moment. He keeps this love young, and it grows with him in years and beauty. On the other hand, he needs no finite occasion for its growth. From the moment he made the movement, the princess is lost. He needs none of this erotic titillation of the nerves at the sight of the loved one, etc. Nor does he need in a finite sense to be continually making his farewell, for his memory of her is an eternal one, and he knows very well that those lovers who are so eager to see one another one more time to say farewell are right to be eager, right to think it will be the last time, for as soon as may be they will have forgotten one another. He has grasped the deep secret that even in loving another one should be sufficient unto oneself. He pays no further finite attention to what the princess does, and just this proves that he has made the movement infinitely. Here we have the opportunity to see whether the movement in the individual is proper or not. There was a person who also believed he had made the movement, but as time went by, the princess did something else, she married, say, a prince, and his soul lost the resilience of resignation. He knew then that he had not made the movement correctly, for one who is infinitely resigned is enough unto himself. The knight does not cancel his resignation. He keeps it just as young as in the first instance. He never lets it go, simply because he has made the movement infinitely. And then in a later section, he moves on to the Knight of Faith. Infinite resignation is the last stage before faith, so that anyone who has not made this movement does not have faith. For only in infinite resignation does my eternal validity become transparent to me, and only then can there be talk of grasping existence on the strength of faith. Let us now have the Knight of Faith make his appearance in the case discussed. He does exactly the same as the other knight. He infinitely renounces the claim to the love, which is the content of his life. He is reconciled in pain. But then comes the marvel. He makes one more movement, more wonderful than anything else, for he says, I nevertheless believe that I shall get her, namely on the strength of the absurd, on the strength of the fact that for God all things are possible. The absurd is not one distinction among others embraced by understanding. It is not the same as the improbable, the unexpected, the unforeseen. The moment the knight resigned, he was convinced of the impossibility, humanly speaking. That was a conclusion of the understanding, and he had energy enough to think it. In an infinite sense, however, it was possible, through renouncing it, as a finite possibility, but then accepting that possibility is at the same time to have given it up. Yet for the understanding there is no absurdity in possessing it, for it is only in the finite world that understanding rules, and there it was and remains an impossibility. On this the Knight of Faith is just as clear. All that can save him is the absurd, and this he grasps by faith. Accordingly, he admits the impossibility and at the same time believes the absurd. For were he to suppose that he had faith without recognizing the impossibility with all the passion of his soul and with all his heart, he would be deceiving himself, and his testimony would carry weight nowhere, since he would not even have come as far as infinite resignation. And then a bit later, through faith I don't renounce anything. On the contrary, in faith I receive everything, exactly in the way it is said that one whose faith is like a mustard seed can move mountains. It takes a purely human courage to renounce the whole of temporality in order to win eternity, but I do indeed win it, and cannot in all eternity renounce that, for it would be a self-contradiction. But it takes a paradoxical and humble courage then to grasp the whole of temporality on the strength of the absurd, and that courage is the courage of faith. Through faith, Abraham did not renounce his claim on Isaac. Through faith, he received Isaac. And that's it for my reading section today. That's it for the footnotes. Just as for those who want to play the game, you can think about those passages. It's a strange language. It might take a while to kind of chew on them. It certainly took a while for me. But if you want to chew on those passages, think about it, and then play that Dragon Cancer. I think you'll see something of what Kierkegaard is talking about there when you come to the section where the parents are separated. For me, Ryan is the Knight of Infinite Resignation. He understands that Joel is dying, that there's nothing that can be done. He gives up his claim to Joel. Like Abraham standing over him with a knife, he is intent. He understands that Joel will be taken from him. He does not make the next move that Abraham does. The reason that Kierkegaard calls Abraham the father of faith, because Abraham, with the knife clutched in his hand, fully intent on killing Isaac, believes that Isaac will be given back to him, that Isaac will not ultimately be taken from him, as he prepares to take Isaac away from him himself with his own hands. Amy makes that move. Amy says that death is the given. She doesn't want to spend her time focusing and tracing the contours of this inevitable doom, but instead she wants to announce the imminent glory of God's forgiveness, of God's resurrection. She believes that by grace, God will dispense miraculous cure. And so she makes the movement. She says, I know very well that my son will die, but nevertheless I shall have him. He shall not be taken from me. Patrick mentions this in the episode, that Abraham is he's not comprehensible. His faith is not understandable in ethical terms. In Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard talks about Abraham. He says that with regard to ethical discourse, which is the universal frame of reference for human activity, speaking humanly, so with regard to the human community, that ethically speaking, Abraham is a murderer. And yet, speaking in a religious meter, or speaking transcendentally, whatever you want to call it, with regard to the actual content of Abraham's actions, it's clear that he is not a murderer, but that he is instead the father of faith. Because he stands, in Kierkegaard's phrase, his paradoxical relationship to the act that he is fully intent on performing moves him outside of the universal realm of ethics, where he can't be understood anymore, and moves him into what he calls an absolute relation to the absolute. So he stands outside of the mediation of human action through ethical discourse to God, and he stands in a direct relationship to God as an individual, divorced from the human community. And so this is expressed in the Bible with God's direct communication to certain individuals. The individual steps outside, and in the act of faith, has an absolute relation to the absolute. But anyway, that's enough of that. Thank you very much for listening to the episode. I'm astounded at your patience, and I'm very grateful if you've listened to all these footnotes. It'd be perfectly understandable if no one did, but I've just offered these here in case anyone's curious. So yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful day wherever you are.